You're listening to The Jacob Valk Show. He's breaking down the latest and greatest in sports as only he can. Follow him on Twitter at RealJacobValk. Here he is, Jacob Valk.
Hello, sports fans! Welcome to another edition of the Jacob Valk Show. I am Jacob Valk, and I've got an interesting show for you today. You're going to get 2/3 of the trifecta. I'm not going to do this day in sports history, and the reason why is because Jimmy Wynn passed away yesterday, so that's going to be my this day in sports history sort of kind of thing, if that makes any sense. I just don't want to do something like that twice, because the way that I'm going to eulogize Jimmy Wynn is the same way that I would do this day in sports history. In this case, I was going to do something on Miller Huggins, but then Jimmy Wynn passed away, and I don't think it makes sense to do the same basic thing twice in one show. So, no this day in sports history. You will get 1 through 4 on my big board, and I'll give you a Mount Rushmore for the Cincinnati Reds. But I gotta start with Michael Brockers making a U-turn and ending back up with the Rams after the Ravens called their deal off with him. Supposedly what happened was the Ravens were scared off by an ankle injury that he had. They couldn't examine him using their own team doctors because of the coronavirus. So an outside doctor said, hey, this is an issue. You guys should be aware of it. The Ravens called the deal off, and he ended back up with the Rams. And he actually got more money. He was set to get $30 million over 3 years from the Ravens. Now he's getting $31.5 million from the Rams. The Rams probably don't have the same concern since he was examined by their team doctors all throughout the season. Assuming everything is okay with his ankle, like it's not too serious, it's a great move for the Rams. Pairing him with Aaron Donald made that defensive line one of the best in football. It really doesn't matter who's playing next to him, whether it's Morgan Fox or Greg Gaines or Sebastian Joseph Day. I could be the third defensive lineman. It wouldn't matter. When you have those two guys playing together, it just does not matter. Ever since he's been in the league, he's been a game wrecker. He would have made perfect sense for the Ravens. They traded Chris Wormley partially to clear a spot for Brockers. Now the Ravens have only 2 choices. They can either sign Jadeveon Clowney, or they can look to the draft. I think they're going to look to the draft. They just don't strike me as the kind of team that's going to spend a bunch of money on Clowney. And I'm still holding out hope that he's going to be a Jet. Please, please, please. But I don't think this is a catastrophic loss for the Ravens. It hurts them. There's no question. Brockers is a really good football player. But the Ravens have always been able to find great defensive talent in the draft. They just have to do it again. I understand that it's easier said than done, but the Ravens have a great track record of doing it. Instead of saving the toy cannon Jimmy Wynn for last, I really want to talk about him now. The toy cannon was born at the wrong time. He should not have played in the 60s and 70s. He really should have been born in the 90s, so he could play today. He is the prototypical sabermetric darling. And what I mean by that is, he's a guy who didn't hit for a great average, got on base a lot. His career batting average was .250, but his career on base percentage was .366. And he finished his career with 291 homers. Not the most impressive home run total ever, but his 162 game average was 25. If you hit 25 homers every year to go with a .366 on base percentage and a .436 slugging percentage, sabermetrics is gonna love you. This guy was a walking machine. He led the league in walks twice. If I had to pick a modern player to compare him to, the best one I can come up with is Aaron Hicks. I know it's not a perfect comparison, because Hicks is a much better fielder than Wynn ever was, but I feel like everything else kind of makes sense. They're both guys who hit for about 25 homers a year, assuming that they stayed healthy. Low average, high on base percentage, and really good speed. In fact, the toy cannon in his prime may have been faster than Aaron Hicks. He came up as a shortstop, did the toy cannon, and he really wasn't that good there. It was really apparent that he just wasn't going to make it as a shortstop. And then he came back as an outfielder and found his calling. Now, while he was never Roberto Clemente in the outfield, he was pretty darn good. .981 career fielding percentage in the outfield for the toy cannon. He played his first full season in 1965 and gave Houston a glimpse of what was to come, as he hit .275 with 22 homers and 73 RBIs, to go with a .371 on base percentage and 43 steals. Not too many people remember that about the toy cannon. He had speed. He just got hurt and it vanished. 1966 was the first of his really big injuries. He tried to catch a Dick Allen fly ball, and he missed it and ended up crashing into the outfield wall at the old Connie Mack Stadium. Dick Allen hit a game-winning inside the park home run, and the toy cannon's 1966 season ended after only 105 games. But he came back in 1967 and had his best season. He made his first All-Star game, hit .249, struck out 137 times, typical Jimmy Wynn, .331 on base percentage, not great, but not terrible. 37 homers, though. 107 RBIs. To go along with a .495 slugging percentage. Yeah, that's pretty good. And he should have been the home run champion that year. Jimmy Wynn played in the Astrodome that year, which was a pitcher-friendly park, and Hank Aaron, the quote-unquote real home run champion that year, played at Fulton County Stadium, a hitter's ballpark. Aaron even later said that the toy cannon deserved to be the home run champion that year. It was in 67 that the toy cannon had his best moment. On June 10th at Crosley Field, in the 8th inning, Wynn hit a shot that went over the scoreboard in left center field and ended up on I-75 outside the stadium. Think about that for a second. You're driving down I-75. It doesn't matter if you know I-75 or not. Admittedly, I don't. I know it's a major interstate, but I've never been on it. You're driving down an interstate, and next thing you know, you see a baseball coming towards you. And there are no kids around throwing them at you. It came off the bat of Jimmy Wynn. If you can find that clip, watch it. The toy cannon's raw power was insane. He was called the toy cannon because he was a small guy, 5'9", 160 pounds, but he had power that drew comparisons to Mickey Mantle. He finished out the late 60s, early 70s by averaging 25 homers, 75 to 85 RBIs, low-ish batting average, 262, but an ungodly on-base percentage, 384, to go along with a 455 slugging percentage. I'm telling you, sabermetricians would have loved this guy now. He would have been their poster child. 1971, he got hurt, though. Was limited to only a 203 average, which kind of skews the average a little bit. But the point is that in the late 60s, early 70s, Wynn continued to rake. 1973 was his last year with the Astros. He only hit .220, 20 homers, 55 RBIs, 91 walks for a .347 on-base percentage, and his slugging percentage dipped to .395. The Astros traded him to the Dodgers, and they thought, okay, that's it, nice career. We're never going to hear from him again. Oh, how wrong they were, as in 1974, the toy cannon made his second All-Star team by hitting .271 with 32 homers and 108 RBIs. He also had a .387 on-base percentage and a .497 slugging percentage. All statistics are from Baseball Reference, by the way. He finished 5th in MVP voting that year, the closest he ever got to MVP. He did win Comeback Player of the Year, though, and the Dodgers won the pennant. He wasn't a great playoff performer, though. I understand that he only made the playoffs once, but a 192 average, 1 homer, 4 RBIs in 9 games, that's not that good. Yeah, the on-base percentage is great, 450, but it's skewed a little bit because he had 9 walks in the 74 NLCS. I understand that's unreal to get 9 walks in 4 playoff games, but the stats are just a little skewed. He wasn't a great playoff performer. In 1975, Wynn came out like a bat out of hell. In the first half, he had .270, 14 homers, 44 RBIs, to go along with a .429 on-base percentage and a .471 slugging percentage. He made his third and final All-Star team, and the Dodgers probably thought to themselves, we have an outfielder for the next 5 years or so. Well, unfortunately, it wasn't meant to be, as he had a nagging shoulder injury that resulted in him really tailing off in the second half. he only hit .201 with a .349 on base percentage, and his slugging percentage dropped to a ghastly .306. That offseason, he was traded to the Braves, and that's when his career kind of ended. He only hit .207, .367 slugging percentage, but he still got his walks. He led all of baseball in walks that year, with 127. He had a .377 on base percentage that year, despite hitting .207. Unreal. But like I said, that really spelled the end of his career. He started out the 77 season with the Yankees, was terrible for him, and he finished his career with the Brewers, where he was terrible also. But don't let that dampen his legacy. There's a reason why the Astros retired his number 24. And Jason Lane, a former outfielder for the Astros, switched from 24 to 16. A very, very classy gesture by Lane. There are some people that want Jimmy Wynn in the Hall of Fame, and they're saying that his death should cause a re-examination of his Hall of Fame candidacy. Look, Wynn was a really, really good player, but not great. He only has 1,665 career hits, 291 homers, and a .366 on base percentage for his career. That's not Hall of Fame worthy. Really, really good player. If you want to put him in the Hall of Very Good, you have an argument for that, but not the Hall of Fame. Having said that, though, I know that he was very beloved in the Houston area. Did a lot of community outreach stuff. And, by all accounts, was an extremely nice man. I never met him, but from everything I've read, he was a great guy. And he passed away yesterday at the age of 78, 2 weeks after his birthday. May he rest in peace. Alright, it's time for 1 through 4 of my 2020 NFL Draft Big Board. Numbers 1 through 4 are Chase Young, Joe Burrow, Jeff Okudah, and Isaiah Simmons. Young continues this trend of these elite defensive prospects in the NFL draft. He's just as talented as guys like Myles Garrett, Jadeveon Clowney, Khalil Mack, Von Miller, and the Bosa's were coming out of school. I can't find anything he does wrong. I really can't. You want to tell me you're a little concerned about the injury? Alright, fine. That's a fair concern, but Nick Bosa missed most of his last year at OSU, and he's already one of the best defensive players in the NFL. I'll tell you what, the injury doesn't scare me. I'd be glad to take him in the first round. We all know that Joe Burrow is going first overall. Chase Young should go second overall. And he will be a fantastic Redskin for a long time. Speaking of Joe Burrow, we all know the story. Borderline undraftable prospect 12 months ago. And then puts together probably the best season in college football history. 5,671 passing yards to go with 60 touchdowns and a national title. He's the kind of guy who NFL GMs dream of. And I think he's going to be a great Bengal. I really do. Here's what I'm concerned about, though. He's not a perfect prospect. I've heard people say that. He's a generational talent. You know, he's the best quarterback prospect we've had since Andrew Luck. I wouldn't go that far. I just wouldn't. The thing that scares me about Burrow is he's a one-year wonder. And I understand that one-year wonders can be successful in the NFL. Andy Dalton was a one-year wonder at a TCU. He's carved out a nice career. You want to mock Andy Dalton? You can, but he's been an above-average quarterback for most of his career. I understand that if you're taking a guy first overall, you don't want above average. You want great. You want elite. You want Hall of Fame. Burrow has that ceiling. His floor is low. His ceiling is sky high. He's a smart kid, great pocket presence, can put the football wherever he wants to, and is extremely tough. Had to overcome a lot of adversity to get to this point. I like that. I think Joe Burrow is going to be a great player for a long time for the Bengals. I really do. Jeff Okudah has some people scared off because of a recent injury, but it doesn't scare me. If you were to build a cornerback prospect from scratch, it'd look a lot like Jeff Okudah. 6'1", 205 pounds, elite cover skills. Quarterbacks just didn't throw to him. The Buckeyes used him a lot like the Jets used Darrelle Revis in his prime. I'm not saying that he's Revis. He actually reminds me a lot of Marshawn Lattimore. But the way that the Buckeyes used him was he just shadowed the opponent's best receiver. And usually he shut him down. The biggest knock on Okudah is he's not a good tackler. I don't want my corners to be good tacklers. That's a bad thing. If your cornerback is getting a lot of tackles, that means he's allowing the catch. And then bringing the receiver down. Darrelle Revis was not a good tackler. That doesn't scare me at all. This guy does have some Revis in him. I don't want to put that pressure on him, but he just does. He reminds me more of Marshawn Lattimore, though, I'm telling you. I've seen some people say Stephon Gilmore. I don't see that as much as I see Lattimore. I know it's lazy to compare him to a prospect from the same school, but they're both physical specimens with great cover skills. Isaiah Simmons is probably the most athletic linebacker I've ever seen coming out of college. This guy ran a 4.39 40 at 6'3.5" and 238 pounds. That's unreal. That's the equivalent of a tank running a 4.4 40. His instincts are great. He's a great run defender. He's a 3-down linebacker, which is really, really important. A lot of these linebackers coming out of school, you need to take out on 3rd down. This guy is an exceptional 3rd down linebacker. He reminds me a lot of Levante David when I watch him play. He's just bigger than David was coming out of school. They're both tremendous in pass coverage and are freakish athletes. Alright, it's time for another correct Mount Rushmore. If you were paying attention earlier, you know that this is about the Cincinnati Reds. And the Reds are a funny team. They've been around since 1882, but they really don't have a great pitcher in their history. Guys like Epa Rixey and Tony Mullane, and Don Gullett. Good pitchers, not great. So there will be no pitchers on this Mount Rushmore. The correct Mount Rushmore is Pete Rose, Johnny Bench, Barry Larkin, and Dave Concepcion. Now, let me just say that this list was really tough to put together. Pete Rose, number 1, is easy, and Bench, number 2, is easy. But 3 and 4 were tough. You can make a case for Barry Larkin, Dave Concepcion, Tony Perez, Joey Votto, Frank Robinson, and Joe Morgan. You can make a case for any of them, but I went with this order because Pete Rose, do you really need me to spell it out? Over 3,300 hits with the Reds. Johnny Bench, arguably the greatest catcher of all time. Actually, I don't think he is. A lot of people will say he is. I actually think it's Ivan Rodriguez. But Johnny Bench, 389 home runs. Leads the Reds all time. And Barry Larkin and Dave Concepcion, very similar players. Both great shortstops. Neither one of them should be in the Hall of Fame. Larkin is, I know that, but he shouldn't be. Larkin's and Concepcion's careers are very, very similar. It's weird. Interesting fact about Concepcion. He scored the 1,000,001st run in Major League Baseball history. He was only a few seconds behind Bob Watson. So that's just an interesting piece of trivia there. I'm sure you thought that I forgot about the Rich Marazzi interview. I didn't. Here it is. You're listening to the Jacob Valk Show. I am Jacob Valk, and I'm fortunate enough to be talking to Rich Marazzi, the author of Yale Football Through the Years. Rich, how are you?
Good, Jacob. How are you?
I'm doing good. So, what can you tell us about Walter Camp?
Well, Walter Camp is probably the father of college football. He played football at Yale. He coached at Yale for several years. His record there was 67-0-2. And basically, he's probably best known for, actually modernizing the game of football. In the early days of football in the 19th century, the football that was played then was actually a game of soccer. Some schools played a rugby style, but the game evolved into a soccer rugby type game, and eventually the football as we know it today. Well, Walter Camp was involved in the line of scrimmage idea, was in the down system, and so many other areas. It had putting like 11 men on one side. So he really modernized the game of football. So he is the high priest of Yale football. And as I guess John Heisman once said, what George Washington was to this country, Walter Camp was to college football.
I like that. I couldn't have said that any better myself. So can you lay out the coaching career of Carmen Koza? And did you like that alliteration?
Yes. Well, Carmen Koza, first of all, came to New Haven in 1963 with John Pont from Miami of Ohio. Pont coached Yale for 2 years. Carmen was on his staff. When he left after the 64 season to go to Indiana, the man who was going to get the Yale job at that time was Joe Paterno.
Really?
That's right, because he actually came in first for the job in 63, but he did not take the job. He decided to stay at Penn State with Rip Engel. And so anyway, the Yale people really wanted Koza in 65, but they felt that because Paterno came in first in 1963, they'd offer him the job first, but he decided anyway to stay at Penn State. So anyway, Carmen coached at Yale from 1965 right through 1996, and was in many great ball clubs, won many Ivy League titles. But if you look at his coaching career, it was 32 years at Yale. can be divided really in the first 16 years and the second 16 years. First 16 years, Yale was a very elite Ivy League program. The last 16 years, they went downhill drastically for a number of different reasons. But whatever. One was, I think, going Division I AA, I think, hurt them in 1982. But anyway, I think the amazing thing about Carmen, I think over 2,000 athletes that he coached, only 5 did not graduate. He was a first-class human being. I knew Carm very well, and he was. This is the second Yale book that I did. The first one I did was called "A Bowl Full of Memories: How Many Years of Football at the Yale Bowl," and that was published in 2014. And I interviewed many former players during this period of time, and virtually every one of them had nothing but high praise for Carmen Koza. He was a gentleman. He was the right man in the right place at the right time, and he was in the right school.
Yeah, no question about that. Carmen Koza was a fantastic coach for Yale, both on the football field and off the football field. So, would you be able to describe the career of Gary Fensick?
Well, Gary Fensick, when he played at Yale, was an offensive player, and probably one of the 2 or 3 toughest players of all time at Yale, especially under the era of Carmen Koza. He went to the Bears and played on the defense. But with Yale, he was an offensive player, and you didn't really get to see his toughness that much on offense until he got to the NFL when he became a defensive back with the Chicago Bears. He was involved in a great play against Princeton, where there was a pitch out to Don Giesecke, and Giesecke threw to Fensick for a long touchdown run, and that's one of the most famous plays he was involved with at Yale. But a great ball player, and a guy who had an outstanding NFL career. But as I said, at Yale, he was an offensive player, and you didn't see much of his toughness that you could see when he became a defensive player with the Chicago Bears.
Did he sing at Yale like he did in Chicago?
Not that I know of. I think in Chicago it was with a group, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was the Super Bowl Shuffle.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, but there was no Yale Shuffle that I know
of. Talking to Rich Marazzi, the author of Yale Football Through the Years. So, what can you tell us about Clint Frank?
Well, the first 3 years that they gave out a Heisman Trophy, actually 1935 was the first year, but it was really more of a plaque at the time, I guess. It was not as elaborate. But the first 2 Heisman Trophy winners that had the trophy as you have today, with the exact same model, was Larry Kelly, 1936, and Clint Frank, 1937. Frank was a great player, a great offensive and defensive player. Back in those days, don't forget, players played 2 ways. And Frank was the Heisman winner in 1937. And I think after the Harvard game, his senior year, Harvard coach went into the Yale locker room and told him he was the greatest player he ever saw. That speaks volumes. And at that time, don't forget, Yale was a top team in the country. I mean, was rated in the top 10 to top 12. They were one of the elite programs still in the United States. So when you're talking Yale football, prior to, let's say, the 1940s, basically, Yale was an elite program in this country. Even as late as 1948, they beat Wisconsin on the road. And they won other big games since. But when you talk about Yale football, there was a time when Yale football was considered one of the top teams in the country. And Clint Frank became eventually, I believe, a great recruiter for Yale. He lived out in the Chicago area, and he came back to New Haven on occasion. And like I say, Kelly and Frank went together like salt and pepper. I mean, they were great players, and to have back-to-back Heisman winners, to me, was a tremendous accomplishment.
No question about that, especially when, you factor in the fact that the Heisman Trophy was in its infancy, and the fact that it went to 2 guys from Yale, and Jay Berwanger obviously being the first one, really, really incredible. So, can you lay out the career of the man with one of the best names in sports history, Pudge Heffelfinger? Well,
Pudge Heffelfinger was probably the first pro football player ever, and he played for Yale in the 19th century. He was a brute of a man. As the story goes, he came back to Yale one time at age 48, I believe, and scrimmaged against Yale. I think he broke somebody's nose or whatever. He was a tough nut. And Pudge Heffelfinger, matter of fact, I have his photo in the first book that I did in 2014. And he was one of the early great Yale ends, and he went out to play, I believe, in Pittsburgh in professional football. I think he was the first paid professional football player. So he has a pretty important legacy in the history of football.
Yeah, you see all these guys getting these multi-million-dollar deals. They should thank Heffelfinger for that.
I guess so.
Would you be able to describe the career of Dick Duran?
Dick Duran is one of the most idolized players in Yale history. Once again, not only for his demeanor, he was a very quiet guy. And if you ever interviewed Dick Duran, he always gave credit to his teammates. Played in the early 70s. He's an all-Ivy player. Of course, he went on to play pro football also. He also coached in the NFL. I think Carmen Costa said that if he was in a phone booth or whatever, you couldn't tackle him. He was that elusive. Made a great run against Columbia, I believe, 1972, an 80-yard run that was historic. And once again, I met Dick for the first time about 3 or 4 years ago, a very humble man. And once again, one of the great Yale running backs. In the 1970s and 1980s, and the 60s also, Yale had some great running backs. And Calvin Hill, Dick Duran. They also had Kenny Hill. They had John Spagnola. They had Mike Sullivan. So they had a cadre of great backs.
No question about that. Talking to Rich Marazzi, the author of Yale Football Through the Years. So, what can you tell us about Howard Jones?
Well, Howard Jones also was a former Yale player who came back to coach football at Yale, had a great record. His brother, Tad Jones, also coached at Yale for many years, and the two coached against each other when Tad, I believe, was in Syracuse, but he never beat his brother Howard. Howard eventually went to USC, had a great record at the University of Southern California. But Howard and Tad Jones, once again, they were around 1906, 1907. They both had outstanding records for Yale football coaches. Tad coached much longer. I think Tad's record was 60, 15-2, I believe. And once again, when you talk about Howard Jones, you also must mention Tad Jones.
Yeah, you took the next question right out of my mouth. So, you spoke about Larry Kelly when you were talking about Clint Frank. I'd like you to go a little more in depth on Kelly if you can. Can you lay out his career?
Well, Kelly played at Yale from 1934 to 1936, and he's the only player to score touchdowns against Princeton and Harvard for 3 straight years. And one of the great games he was involved in as a sophomore was 1934 game against Princeton, and Yale beat Princeton that day 7-0. Princeton was undefeated in a span of 30 games, and Yale went to New Jersey that day with a much smaller traveling squad than Princeton put in the field. And one of the Yale players said that the Princeton players looked at Yale like lambs of slaughter. It was going to be a blowout game. And yet, the entire same 11 men played the entire game for Yale. They won 7-0. Kelly scored the only touchdown. And he was also an outstanding baseball player, by the way. He was offered a contract to play with the St. Louis Cardinals by Branch Rickey. He was a very handsome man, too. And he also was offered, I believe, a contract in Hollywood, which he declined. Never played pro football. He was very, I understand, skeptical of the game at that time, of the morals and ethics of playing professional football. So he declined to play professional football, basically. His Heisman Trophy was auctioned for over $300,000, and I think it was in the year 2000. And he died a very tragic death. He took his own life not long after. And anyway, a great ball player, a great man, a great Yale legend, Larry Kelly.
No question about that. Sad ending, though. I didn't know that about Kelly. Oh, man, that's a bummer.
Yeah, his wife went to church in the morning, and she came back, and she found Larry dead sitting in the chair. And from what I had read, I think she said that she did not even was aware that he owned a gun.
Oh, man alive.
Yeah.
All right, let's bring the positive vibes back. Would you be able to describe the career of Amos Alonzo Stagg?
Well, once again, Amos Stagg was a 19th century player with Yale. I think he's credited for inventing the batting cage. He also coached at the University of Chicago for many years. He came back to Yale. He would give talks to the team on occasion. One was before a big Harvard game. So once again, here was a guy who was a pioneer also in the history of college football. He coached at Chicago and other places for many, many years, well into a late age, as you well know. And so Amos Alonzo Stagg, once again, you see, Yale was the fountainhead of college football. And many of the coaches in the 19th century and 20th century had their roots at Yale. Until hegemony of football moved out west, basically, so much began here at Yale. And you talk to many people who are football scholars, they will tell you that Yale is the central focal point of college football.
Talking to Rich Marazzi, the author of Yale Football Through the Years. And, Rich, I'll get you out on this. What did a typical day look like for you when you were writing this book?
Well, when you say what did a typical day look like for me, actually it was a fun project. After I finished the first book in 2014, which is a much larger book, by the way. If you get a chance, you ought to call the Skyhorse Company so you get a copy of that. It's okay. That book was 407 pages with 377 photos. It was a coffee table sized book. This book is a supplement to that book. So when I did the first book, I realized the kind of material I had, and a friend of mine who was a Yale grad way back in 1951 named Joel Alderman, he kind of got involved with me on his own, basically, sent me different kinds of material. So basically what I did was I was just putting in bits and pieces here and then as a hobby. I knew I wanted to do this kind of date in Yale football history as a supplement to the first book. This book would give the Yale football program kind of a different X-ray, be a more, direct account of the Yale football games from 1872 to the present. Well, whereas the first book was more anecdotal, more first-person storytelling by former players. So this book was a totally different style. And so a typical day for me would be to come down to the computer, basically, and fill in the gaps when I would get new material. It was like putting together a puzzle and keeping my profile, was a Word document, on the computer and filling in the pieces. It was
now,
fun.
Which one? I'm sure it was. Which one do you like more, the 2014 one or this one?
Well, the 2014 one, I think probably was a classic, only because I think it's the most definitive and the most, shall we say, pictorial history book ever of Yale football, of any college football, not only Yale. Not because I wrote it. I credit the Skyhorse Company at the time for the tremendous job that they did with that book, including, as I said, 377 photos going back to the 19th century. So what I'm saying is, but however, this book is a different kind of book. Some people will read this book, and I think the McFarland Company did a great job with this book. Some people will read this book and might like it even more because it's a different kind of book, depends on your taste. So, once again, like I say, it's hard for me. If I had to choose between the two, obviously I'd take the first one only because of the size and length of it and the pictorial history that went with it.
So I got you. I got you on the lesser one.
Well, I'll put it this way: they're both very close cousins. Okay.
All right, sounds good, Rich. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you.
All right, that was Rich Marazzi. His book is Yale Football Through the Years. Thanks for listening. Here comes the outro.
Thanks for the plug, Jacob from the past. It does mean a lot. I have no idea if there are going to be any big football stories that break over the weekend. If not, then you'll get the trifecta. If there is, then we'll see what happens. I hope you have a good weekend. Stay safe. Stay inside. Until Monday, I am Jacob Valk saying that I have an off-air vocabulary and an on-air vocabulary.